and give you a little bit of background on ecig. For those of you not familiar with ecig, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information and resources for renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We also provide peer-to-peer networking opportunities, information and knowledge sharing, and professional education experiences. Our most recent activity was our annual Forecasting and Markets Workshop in Denver last month. And our next activity will be the Fall Technical Workshop the last week of October in Charlotte. These workshops deal with a full range of issues associated with integrating wind and solar into electric, gas, and thermal systems. And they also deal with the coupling to energy-consuming infrastructures, especially electric transportation, buildings, and industry. Information is available on the upcoming workshop, and everyone is invited to attend. ecig is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. If you're new to ecig, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find us at www.ecig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, the phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. So please use the question and answer box on the lower right side of your screen to submit questions, and we'll save 10 minutes or so at the end for the Q&A. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so don't be afraid to use the Q&A box. Okay, so today's webinar is on the topic of the impacts of variable renewable energy on wholesale power prices, implications for the merchant market value of wind and solar. This is a topic of interest to most everyone involved in renewable energy today and has stirred up a lot of interest in the related topic of market design. At the end of the webinar today, my hope is that everyone will be a little better informed and have a little better sense for the outlook on market pricing. The webinar will feature Dr. Ryan Weiser from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Ryan received his Ph.D. in Energy and Resources from UC Berkeley. He oversees a 30-person group that does research on electric system planning, reliability, and regulation, as well as energy efficiency, renewable energy, and demand response. Ryan has published more reports, papers, and articles than I can count, so I won't even try. Suffice it to say that he is an internationally recognized and well-respected scientist and author, and I consider myself lucky to count him as a colleague and a friend. I feel very fortunate to have Ryan here with us today. On a personal note, as I've gotten in the habit of doing, I took a look on LinkedIn last night, and I found out that Ryan and I have over 450 shared connections, which I think means that we must see too much of the same people. Not surprisingly, Ryan is an active participant in ecig events, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say today. The webinar will summarize recent research by LB&L that has assessed the past and possible future impacts of wind and solar on wholesale power prices, and how those changes in pricing patterns may uniquely affect the merchant market value of variable generation resources. Given the potential for value deflation as the penetration of VRE increases, a variety of measures that might be taken to enhance the value of wind and solar will be discussed. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And Ryan, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Charlie, and good morning or good afternoon all. It's certainly a pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks again to Charlie for the kind introduction, and to Charlie and to ecig for providing this opportunity to summarize what you will see to be a relatively large and ongoing body of work at Berkeley Lab that is collectively doing just what Charlie described. That is, trying to understand the impacts of wind and solar, or variable renewables, on wholesale market electricity prices, trying to assess the implications of those impacts for the grid system market value of variable renewables, or VRE, in wholesale markets both now and potentially into the future, and finally summarizing some recent analysis and ongoing analysis that look to various approaches that might be used to boost the market value of renewables and therefore help maintain economic competitiveness as and if wind and solar continue to increase in their deployment. As for the organization of my presentation today, I'm going to follow what I just described one by one, by and large. I will begin with some basic background on why the impacts of VRE on wholesale prices matter, especially as it relates to the grid system market value of wind and solar. I'll then turn to some ongoing work at LBL, wherein we've been looking to the past to better understand the historical and recent impacts of wind and solar on wholesale prices and the implications of any pricing changes on the market value of those two generation sources. After that historical look, I'll then turn to some recent research that has focused on the future and highlight work in which we sought to gain some level of insight into how those pricing and market value effects might progress under various future scenarios for VRE penetration. Importantly, I'll also identify and summarize a subset of approaches that might be used to mitigate the value deflation that I'll otherwise show and to therefore boost the grid system market value of renewables, in this case drawing on some very early and preliminary work at LBL. This is by no means comprehensive or complete, but nonetheless that I hope you will find interesting and useful. And then finally, I'll end the presentation with some brief summary remarks and by listing some possible future research directions before turning it over to some quick Q&A. Before launching in, I would like to very much acknowledge the funding support of the U.S. Department of Energy for providing the support necessary to do the work that I'll be describing today, though I would at the same time note that and provide the important caveat that my views do not necessarily reflect those of the funders. Moreover, I also want to very much acknowledge that much of the content in this presentation remains in draft form and therefore may be refined before publication. And as such, if anyone on the call today sees what you think may be a mathematical error, a conceptual error, or simply an interpretation error, I very much encourage you to get in contact with me after the webinar. And then finally, let me also just acknowledge that this presentation is really a compilation of a lot of different threads of past and ongoing work at Berkeley Lab involving a large number of different folks. And thanks especially to Andrew Mills, Dov Milstein, Yo Seal, Mark Bollinger, Songun Zhang, and others at LBL for providing much of the inspiration and content that you'll see in the slides that follow. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's begin with a little bit of context and framing that will help provide a little bit of background for the core presentation that will then follow. As many, perhaps most of you on the webinar are already well aware, significant near-term wind and solar growth in the United States is really all but assured. After all, federal tax incentives in the form of the production tax credit and investment tax credit continue to drive deployment, at least in the near to medium term. And technology has advanced and technology costs have declined such that with the help of federal tax support, wind and solar power purchase agreement prices, which are summarized on the figure here in front of you, have dropped below 2 cents per kilowatt hour on average for wind and to around or below 3 cents per kilowatt hour on average for solar. Moreover, state policies also continue to play a role in driving wind and solar deployment, and that's especially true in the eastern and western portion of the U.S., with the figures on this slide depicting both the historical on the left and possible future role on the right of state clean energy standards in driving demand for renewable energy. At the same time, though, I think it's also clear that past and future growth of wind and solar has and will be dictated not only by the direct costs of variable renewables, but also from state and federal policy, but also by the ability of wind and solar to offset other grid system costs, or said differently, by the value that wind and solar deliver in wholesale electricity markets. After all, whether you're purchasing electricity or as a consumer, a car or an Apple, purchasing decisions are always based on considerations of both cost and value. And as depicted by the graphs on the right of this particular slide, a rather sizable portion of recent wind and solar additions in the U.S. are occurring outside of state standards or mandates. And so those projects, especially which represent more than 50% of the total wind and solar additions over the last number of years, should be influenced not only by power purchase agreement prices that wind and solar are able to deliver, but also by the expected grid system market value of those resource options, meaning the value of wind and solar in providing energy and potentially, where available, capacity and ancillary services in wholesale power markets. And of course, those values secondarily are impacted by the very market designs and prices that emerge from those wholesale markets. Okay, so with that context then, what do we find in terms of historical and recent wholesale pricing trends, the impacts of wind and solar on those trends, and ultimately the wholesale merchant market value of wind and solar assets? Well, starting with annual average wholesale prices, that's what's depicted on this slide. Both the median price of 60,000 plus wholesale pricing nodes in the U.S., covering all 7 organized independent system operators or ISOs operating in the U.S. And the chart also shows the 10th to 90th percentile ranges in annual average prices over those same 60,000 plus wholesale pricing points across the nation. And as shown in the figure, there has been a bit of a rebound in average annual wholesale prices over the last couple of years. You can see that rise from the year 2016 through to 2018. But over the decade, there's clearly been a significant decline in wholesale power prices, at least annual average wholesale prices. Now, there's some discussion and debate about the drivers for those wholesale price reductions, and our analysis at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab shows that the decline in natural gas prices, at least over this decadal period, has really been the dominant factor, at least when considering impacts on market-wide annual average prices. Growth in VRE, meanwhile, plays a much more modest and secondary role in comparison to the effect of natural gas prices. And in particular, in our analysis, we developed a relatively simplified model of market-wide wholesale power prices for each of the 7 ISOs, and then used that model to assess the drivers of changes in the overall average wholesale price between the year 2008 and the year 2017. Now, to give you just a bit of a flavor for the results, the figure on the left-hand side of this slide depicts one example of our findings, focused in this case specifically on ERCOT. And in particular, the modeled annual average wholesale price in 2008 is shown as the leftmost bar, and as the rightmost blue bar, you can see the modeled annual average price in the year 2017. The green and red bars in between those blue bars, meanwhile, represent the modeled impact of 14 different factors on the decline of annual average wholesale prices over this 2008 to 2017 period. And one just really immediately observes from this particular chart is that the decline in natural gas prices over this period is quite clearly the single largest driver of changes in overall average wholesale prices. Notably and somewhat interestingly, the second largest driver has been the addition of efficient new natural gas-fired generation to the ERCOT grid. That's the conventional additions column or bar in this particular chart. Now, to be sure, wind and to a lesser extent solar are also found to have influenced annual average market-wide prices over this period, but the scale of those impacts are clearly relatively more modest and are in the range of a number of the other factors also listed in the figure. Now, to be clear, we did conduct the same analysis, not just for ERCOT, but really for all 7 of the ISOs. The results of that analysis are depicted in the figure on the right. And what we find is that the ERCOT results hold, at least directionally, for the other ISOs as well. Namely, the decline in natural gas prices has tended to be the single most substantial price driver in overall market-wide annual average prices over this period, with growth of VRE coming in with a large number of other factors, typically as a distant and secondary set of players. Now, that being said, while growth in VRE has not yet had perhaps an outsized impact on average annual market-wide prices, we are beginning to see some very real and meaningful impacts from wind and solar on the temporal and geographic trends in wholesale market prices. The two maps on this slide, for example, show the growth in the frequency of negative wholesale prices between 2013 on the left and 2018 on the right. And we can immediately see a modest growth in the frequency of negative wholesale prices in California, correlated at least in part with the rapid expansion of solar in the state. And we can see with wind increasing the prevalence of negative pricing in the middle of the country and perhaps in northern New England and New York as well, with some of those pricing nodes in 2018 experiencing negative wholesale prices 10% of the hours or even more. Now, I want to be very clear that variable renewable energy is not the only driver of negative wholesale prices. In fact, in California, one of the years with the greatest frequency of negative wholesale prices was 2011. 2011 preceded the significant growth of solar, but was a year in which we still had all of our pre-existing nuclear assets running full bore. And it was also a very wet year, and so the negative pricing that occurred in 2011 was in large measure due to the combination of inflexible nuclear assets and a significantly greater amount of hydropower generation than has occurred in many years subsequent to that time frame. That being said, it is very clear that solar and wind are playing a significant role in the wholesale price patterns temporally and geographically that we've been witnessing in recent years. Let's probably try just maybe a couple of examples of that, a couple of hot spots in particular. This particular slide, for example, reviews pricing patterns in western Oklahoma in 2018, clearly a hot spot of negative wholesale prices in recent years. And what the figures illustrate on this particular slide is that low average prices and a greater frequency of negative prices tend to correlate very clearly with periods of high wind and low load. Basically, you've got low net load creating a situation where wholesale prices will oftentimes go negative. That's what the two charts on the left depict. The chart on the right, meanwhile, illustrates that wind generally is just screaming during the negative price hours that occur on a system-wide basis. This next slide, meanwhile, illustrates how the diurnal profile of wholesale prices in California and the frequency and timing of negative wholesale prices has changed over time, in this case between the year 2013 and the year 2018 as solar has grown in the state. And the figures here demonstrate, not surprisingly at all, that solar has tended to depress wholesale prices in the middle of day, increase the frequency of negative pricing as well in those same hours, with prices then rising to meet the early evening ramp in net load. Another interesting finding from this particular chart is that it provides a little bit of a signal, not definitive proof, but a signal that growth of solar in the state is depressing prices in some hours, but perhaps as a consequence of the net load ramp is actually causing increases in prices in other hours. And so the so-called merit order effect is not always universally negative. There's also a greater frequency of price volatility and perhaps higher number of price spikes as a consequence of the growth in solar generation. Now, the consequences of those wholesale price changes, not surprisingly, are rather profound. They go well beyond the implications for the merchant wholesale grid system value of wind and solar. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing rather narrowly and exclusively on the implications for variable renewables. Starting with wind power, at LBL, we've recently modeled the wholesale energy and capacity value of wind in 2018, focusing on existing wind plants in the 7 ISO regions. And this analysis considers the hourly output profile of each of those existing wind power plants across the nation, the hourly real-time wholesale energy market prices at the pricing nodes to which those plants connect, aka the LMPs, and they also consider any capacity markets or requirements and rules that exist in the region in question. And the resulting estimates include the combined energy and capacity merchant market value of each wind plant located in an ISO region, meaning basically the market value or revenue that the plant would earn were it selling its energy and capacity into local wholesale electricity markets. And what we find, as shown on this figure in front of you, is that on a nationwide basis, the average annual wholesale market value of wind in 2018 was about $22 per megawatt hour on an overall average basis. Now, that figure is considerably lower than the $36 per megawatt hour that a generalized 24/7 flat block of power would have earned in these markets in that same year. And the discount that wind is experiencing in comparison to that generalized 24/7 flat block of power is due to location-related transmission congestion, to a very limited extent curtailment, and finally to the fact that the hourly temporal profile of wind output is oftentimes anti-correlated with net load and with wholesale prices. Now, to be sure, those national average figures mask a considerable amount of project-to-project and regional variation in wind's merchant market value. And so in this next chart here, we supplement the national average results that I just presented with our estimates of the regional average market value of wind for each ISO, again, considering both energy and potentially capacity value. Now, these estimates showed that wind's merchant market value in 2018 was especially low in the high wind regions of SPP and ERCOT at $17 and $18 per megawatt hour respectively, but considerably higher estimates of market value are found above $30 or even above $40 per megawatt hour in New England, California, and PJM. Finally, one way of depicting trends in the merchant market value of a resource is to normalize the estimated market value of that resource in any particular year by the value of a generalized flat block of power in the region as a whole. This is a factor that comes with multiple terms or multiple names. I will use the word value factor, and it simply represents the fractional amount of value relative to a flat baseload block of power that, in this case, a wind generator might earn in these wholesale markets on average. Now, the results of those calculations shown in the two figures on this slide are rather messy. It's clear that value factors move up and down within particular regions and vary pretty considerably by region over time and with penetration. But nonetheless, the figure on the right does suggest that the value factor of wind tends to decline with wind penetration, with the value of wind often being on the order of 70 to 100% that of a flat block of power at very low penetration levels, but then declining perhaps to about 60% that of a flat block of power once one reaches 20% wind penetration, at least in the regions of study that we have included here. Now, to be clear, while so far I've been focused exclusively on wind, directionally similar trends are apparent for solar, at least in the nation's largest solar market, aka California. And this slide, as one example, shows the results of a somewhat similar calculation, albeit a more coarse and restricted one, of the combined energy and capacity value of solar in the California ISO, with our estimates showing declines in the market value of solar from roughly $70 per megawatt hour in 2012 to just over $30 per megawatt hour in more recent years, again, due to reductions in both the energy and capacity of solar, in large measure a consequence of the growth in solar in the state and the resulting changes in the temporal pricing patterns that I summarized a little bit earlier. Okay, so despite these findings of the declining grid system merchant market value of wind and solar, some of you may be somewhat unconcerned. After all, the cost of wind and solar have also declined over time, and indeed, as depicted in the two charts on this slide, it is generally true that wind and solar power purchase agreement prices over the last 10 years for wind and over the last 6 or 7 years for solar, those price reductions in wind and solar PPAs have actually outpaced the deflationary value effects that I just highlighted, such that with the available tax incentives in place, wind and solar PPA prices remain quite attractive in many regions of the country relative to these recent market value estimates. So the sky is not falling here, at least thus far. The cost of wind and solar, as evidenced by power purchase agreement prices, have fallen at a commensurate or even greater rate than the value reduction. That being said, that will not automatically persist into the future, and is especially the case perhaps given the scheduled phase down in federal tax support for wind and solar. And so understanding the future economics of wind and solar, therefore, requires forecasting not only the LCOE of these resources, but also forecasting future average wholesale prices and the geographic and temporal patterns of those prices. So here's where I'm going to transition specifically from discussing past and recent trends in wholesale prices and VRE market values to instead summarizing some recent research that is a bit more forward-looking in nature, and that in part intended to understand how wind and solar might impact wholesale prices at even higher levels of penetration. Before doing that, though, I do want to start by offering a big whopper of a caveat, and that is that forecasting future wholesale pricing is devilishly tricky business. It's not for the faint of heart. First off, as I suggested earlier, one of the core drivers, maybe the core driver of overall average wholesale electricity prices is the price of natural gas. But as depicted in the graphic on this slide, the energy industry's collective ability to accurately forecast natural gas prices is rather miserable. In addition to those demonstrable challenges of accurately forecasting natural gas prices, the difficulties of forecasting wholesale electricity prices are also enhanced by uncertainties over how markets might be designed in the future. Will capacity markets exist, for example, and if so, with what designs? How might ancillary service markets be adjusted or impacted by either the growth of variable renewables or perhaps the growth of DER and storage? More generally, how will policy support impact the entry and exit of both thermal and renewable assets, and how might storage, demand-side flexibility, and transmission impact pricing? These are all really vexing complexities, making price forecasting tricky business indeed. And if that's not complicated enough, the forecasting challenges, at least as it relates to wind and solar, is even greater. And it's greater due to the need to accurately assess not only annual average wholesale prices, but also the detailed temporal and geographic pricing patterns that, as I showed earlier, can greatly impact the market value of wind and solar. Notwithstanding all those challenges, though, in work that we at LBL completed last year in concert with LCG Consulting, we sought to better understand, parametrically at least, the possible implications of future growth of wind and solar, not only on wholesale prices, but also presented in the slides that follow on the wholesale market value of those generation resources. More specifically, we conducted our analysis focusing on a single year, the year 2030, across 4 regions of the country: ERCOT, SPP, CAISO, and New York ISO. In each of those regions, we then looked at 4 different wind and solar growth scenarios. One of those scenarios is just a comparison case. It's the low VRE future case, in which, rather unrealistically, wind and solar shares basically remain at their levels from 2016. And that particular scenario, while unrealistic, is used again solely as a contrast to 3 higher VRE cases, in which solar and wind combine, albeit in different proportions, to equate to roughly 40% of regional electricity supply. So these are, mid-level penetration scenarios, let's call them, at around 40%, or loosely double the higher penetrations that we see today in places like ERCOT, SPP, and the CAISO. Now, I don't have the time, and perhaps nor do many of you have the interest in hearing the gory details of the modeling approach that we took and how we addressed some of those vexing complexities that I highlighted earlier, but I would like to just summarize a couple of points here. The first is that our focus was really on understanding the directional impacts and qualitative impacts of VRE on pricing trends and the related implications, more so than on absolute dollar values. And as such, I encourage you to focus more so on those directional trends than on the absolute numerical values shown in the two slides that follow. Secondly, our modeling included both capacity expansion and production simulation both, and in so doing, it includes both plant retirements and additions, such that the derived prices that I'll show in a moment are just sufficient to ensure resource adequacy. Third, the modeling does presume that the basic energy and ancillary service market designs of the recent past persist into the future. That means price caps in many regions. It means the ORDC and ERCOT. It means co-optimization of energy and ancillary service markets. It means emissions prices in those states and regions that have emissions prices. We haven't tried to forecast changes in fundamental wholesale market design, even if those might be anticipated with greater growth of variable renewables. Fourth, importantly, we assume relatively little growth in storage, and the implication of that assumption is that the resulting price volatility and ancillary service prices that I'll show in the slides that follow may be somewhat greater than one might anticipate in practice or reality. And then finally, and to some degree countering that storage assumption, we do assume that transmission is built out to minimize curtailment, in this case resulting in perhaps less local price volatility than one might anticipate in practice. Okay, so with all of those caveats, limitations, and observations, what do we find? Well, briefly, we find in each of the four regions that higher wind and solar penetrations tend to depress annual average time-weighted wholesale energy prices. And in addition to that, we find that growth in wind and solar have rather profound implications for the temporal patterns of wholesale prices. Specifically, we see growth in the frequency of low-priced hours, especially in the case of high solar shares. We see increasing pricing volatility and higher ancillary service prices, though those, again, might be partially ameliorated with the growth of solar, or rather storage, which we did not evaluate in detail. And then finally, we see substantial changes in diurnal pricing patterns, again, especially due to the growth of solar, and in significant measure, in effect, mimicking the so-called duck curve. So that's the quick summary of the wholesale pricing results associated with this particular study. Now, in addition to trying to understand the impact of wind and solar on wholesale prices, we then also want to better understand what those wholesale price changes, were they to come to be, what impact would those have on the market value of wind and solar in the 2030 timeframe, considering energy and where appropriate capacity markets as well. And in particular, our analysis finds, perhaps not surprisingly, that as wind and solar penetrations increase, their wholesale market values continue to decline. In this case, very consistent with the empirical, historically focused results that I summarized a little earlier. The two graphics on this slide, for example, contrast the wholesale market value of wind and solar in 2030 in the low VRE case and in the high wind and solar cases, respectively, and they do so for each of the four regions of study. We find, based on these particular price series, that the wholesale market value of wind, as an example, is found to be 14 to 42% lower in the high wind cases than in that somewhat unrealistic but comparator low VRE scenario, with the degree of reduction depending on the region. The market value of solar, meanwhile, drops even more precipitously and ends up being 58 to 76% lower in that high solar case than in the unrealistic low VRE scenario, again, with the range reflecting different regional values. Okay, so admittedly, the work that I have just presented intends to be just a little bit provocative, maybe even a bit of a wake-up call, trying to demonstrate that wind and solar are already impacting wholesale prices, at least in some ways, that one consequence of those impacts is a degree of self-cannibalization, whereby increased wind and solar penetrations progressively eat into their own market value, and as well that this value deflation effect will persist as and if growth continues, absent some sort of offsetting and ameliorating mitigant. At the same time, though, it's of course equally important to look for those mitigants, that is, to look for cost-effective solutions that might help maintain the economic competitiveness of wind and solar at even higher levels of deployment. The rest of this presentation will really focus on the options, or at least a subset of the options that exist, and some initial analysis of their potential implications, at least in some cases. So what are some of those options? Well, of course, one approach to maintaining economic competitiveness is to try to do what we've done so far. That is, let's try to just outrun value deflation by continuing to press down on the cost of wind and solar. After all, as I indicated earlier, thus far at least, power purchase agreement prices for wind and solar have declined at a faster pace than value deflation. And analysts and results from analysts and experts, as illustrated in the two graphics on this slide, suggest that further technological improvements and cost reductions for both wind and solar are certainly possible in the years ahead. So certainly continued reductions in the direct cost of wind and solar will play a significant, perhaps an important and perhaps significant role in mitigating the otherwise adverse effects of value deflation as they have in the past. But in addition to trying to outrun the effect through cost reduction, of course, another option is to try to minimize the value deflation at the source, which is illustrated conceptually in this figure, might be accomplished both through the application of system-friendly VRE plants, or alternatively through the evolution of the larger electricity system to be more friendly and amenable to VRE integration. Now, for the remainder of this presentation, or most of the remainder of this presentation, I'll be digging into a subset of the options listed on this particular slide, and for the purpose of this presentation, focusing to a much greater extent on the system-friendly VRE options that are listed in green. And in so doing, I'm not making a value judgment that those by necessity are more important than the other factors that tend to fall in the VRE-friendly system category. But LBL does have some potentially interesting recent and ongoing results that I do want to show that illustrate the size, or at least directionally the size, and roughly the size of the impact that might accrue from some of the items in green. And so those are the ones that I'll be focusing on. I do want, as an important caveat, to note that the analytical results that I'll be showing in the following slides are, in many cases, very partial and preliminary, and will certainly benefit from further refinement, that is. And indeed, in one of the final slides of the presentation, I highlight a number of possible research directions, many of which build on the very early and preliminary analytical results that I'll be showing in the slides that follow. Okay, so starting with the system-friendly VRE options then, 4 general approaches are listed on this particular slide. And the first is site selection. And in short, location matters. This map, as one example, shows the same estimates of wind's wholesale market value in 2018 that I presented earlier in this presentation. Earlier in the presentation, I summarized the results in terms of the national average, as well as averages for individual ISOs. But here I provide a greater level of resolution and show the same results at a project-by-project level. And in so doing, we can clearly see that the market value of wind varies substantially from as low as $6 per megawatt hour for a specific constrained plant in SPP to as high as $70 per megawatt hour for a nicely located plant in the New England region. Generally speaking, we see higher values in portions of PJM, New England, New York, and California, and lower values in the wind-rich interior of the country. Now, of course, in practice, when siting, whether for wind shown here or for solar not shown here, that siting is all about a balancing act between value and direct cost. And as everyone who knows the wind industry well knows, the cost of wind in New England, PJM, and California is also higher than the cost of wind in the interior of the country. But by balancing value and cost concepts at the same time and through careful site selection, one may be able to enhance the market value of, again, wind shown here, but also solar, albeit not shown here. A second option involves technology choice and design, and there are a variety of approaches here, many of which merit additional investigation, though these effects may in general be somewhat less than the effect of location. Continuing here with wind, and as just one example, ongoing work at Berkeley Lab finds that the large rotor and tall tower wind machines that have become common in recent years, if those trends continue into the future, that those large rotor tall tower machines have the benefit not only of increasing the capacity factor of wind plants, but also the side benefit of boosting the wholesale market value of wind. Now that price and value impact, or that value impact rather, is at or around $2 per megawatt hour in some cases based on 2018 wholesale prices, and one might anticipate that the value boost associated with large rotor tall tower machines might be greater in the future as wind penetrations continue to grow. Now, this particular example does naturally focus on wind, but technology choice and design options, of course, also exist for PV, including playing with orientation, tracking systems, and even oversizing the module DC array relative to the size of the inverter. Third, up to this point, I've really focused exclusively on the value of wind and solar in providing energy and, where available, capacity in wholesale markets. But with growing market maturity and with revisions to wholesale power market rules, it's certainly possible that VRE over time might also provide additional ancillary or essential grid services, including regulation. Though we find, at least based on some very simple and early analysis, that this source of revenue is not only limited due to relatively small and thin markets for ancillary services, at least up to this point, but it's also unlikely to provide a major value boost for wind and solar, at least at wind and solar penetrations up to about 40%, and if considering only the direct revenue possibilities alone. The two figures on this slide, for example, use the future-focused modeling results that I summarized earlier and illustrate initially the value drop considering only energy and capacity for wind and solar when moving from that low VRE case that I described earlier to the high VRE cases. The figures then also, though, illustrate the possible value enhancement if wind and solar participated specifically and solely in the regulation down market associated with those future wholesale market price estimates. Now, to be clear, there's a lot more work to be done in this space to better understand both the direct and indirect value benefits of VRE participating in ancillary service markets. That analysis should consider higher penetration levels, not only the provision of downward regulation, but also upward reserves and ramping. It might consider the impacts of storage on the price of the various ancillary services that might derive in the future, and it might, following work by E3 for solar and others, also consider the possible indirect benefits of the provision of ancillary services by VRE by virtue of having the capability of decommitting thermal units and therefore reducing minimum generation issues. So a lot of additional work to be done in this area, but the early results that we've conducted suggest that AS participation may not be a major savior for wind and solar, at least in the near to medium term. Fourth, what might be a savior, at least in the near term, at least for solar, is hybridization with storage. The cost of battery storage in particular has plummeted in recent years, as everyone on the phone certainly well knows, and so too has the additional cost of adding storage to solar assets, especially in light of the availability of the federal ITC for storage when paired with solar. And as a consequence, and as shown in the figure on the left here, of the 280 gigawatts of solar that currently sit in the nation's transmission interconnection queues, a full 20% of that capacity is planned as a solar plus storage hybrid. Wind storage hybrids, meanwhile, appear somewhat less compelling, at least in the near term, and at least if judged by market activity, as only about 2% of the 230 gigawatts of wind in transmission interconnection queues has been proposed as a hybrid facility with storage. Now, the rapid recent interest in solar plus storage hybrids is due not solely to the availability of the investment tax credit. That does play a significant role, as does the declining cost of battery storage. But of course, also driving these trends is the potential value enhancement of pairing solar with storage. This particular slide shows some, again, very early and preliminary analysis from Berkeley Lab, and it focuses on a common solar plus storage configuration in California, whereby storage is sized at 25% of the PV nameplate capacity and has 4 hours of duration. Focusing on that particular configuration and based on a large number of simplifying assumptions, gross simplifying assumptions in some cases, we find that adding storage to solar PV in California could have boosted the combined assets market value by roughly $15 per megawatt hour, at least if focused on recent historical wholesale prices and considering as well capacity costs and rules over the last 3 years. Now, importantly, that $15 per megawatt hour value enhancement is greater than the additional cost as witnessed through recent PPA price adders of pairing solar plus storage, which in recent years, recent months even, have tended to be cost increases of anywhere from $4 to $10 per megawatt hour. So this analysis, again, admittedly very early and limited with a good number of gross simplifying assumptions, suggests that it is already economically viable to pair solar with storage in California when focused on energy and capacity alone and not focused on ancillary services. Okay, I would like to broaden the view a bit now. As I noted earlier, possible alleviants to value deflation come in two forms: system-friendly VRE, which is what I have focused on thus far, and VRE-friendly systems, which I will now describe in very brief form. Now, again, I'm not focusing in this presentation on VRE-friendly grid systems, but I do want to acknowledge that second category, as there are plenty of options within that category that also aim towards a more VRE-friendly system that would then subsequently have knock-on positive benefits on the grid system market value of wind and solar. And in particular, there is a generally strong agreement that large and efficient wholesale markets that accurately reward supply and demand side flexibility will be important. And indeed, that cost-effective supply and demand side flexibility can, in turn, help increase the market value of VRE as penetrations grow. There's certainly plenty of research documenting those results from a large number of parties that I will not summarize here. Among all of those options, one of the most compelling, at least in the near term and for wind, is new transmission. Indeed, just as solar and storage are quite complementary bedfellows, so too are transmission and wind. And while the cost of transmission, of course, also needs to be considered, one should not look at only one side of the coin. One needs to consider cost and value. That being said, one need look no further than ERCOT and SPP to see the positive impacts to the market value of wind of transmission expansion. In ERCOT, for example, the build out of the CREZ transmission lines in West Texas 5+ years ago substantially reduced the prevalence of negative wholesale prices. That's illustrated by the charts on the left-hand side of this slide, while at the same time substantially reducing curtailment and boosting the value factor or market value of wind in the region. More recently, we've also seen a similar kind of effect coming out of SPP, and specifically in SPP, the build out really of a single transmission line in early 2018 had the effect of reducing the frequency of negative pricing and curtailment just between 2 years, between 2017 and 2018, while at the same time increasing the value factor of wind in the region. Now, to be sure, there's still significant negative pricing in the SPP region, but that negative pricing has reduced roughly in half between those 2 years due to the build out of a single new transmission line. And again, illustrating the significant role and indeed importance of transmission to maintaining the market value of wind in otherwise constrained areas of the grid. Okay, so we are now finally coming to an end of my presentation today, and I'm keenly aware that not only have I gone through a large volume of slides and results, but also that some of those results are admittedly quite preliminary in nature. But if there's maybe one message I'd leave you with, it's simply that chasing grid parity or achieving economic competitiveness for wind and solar is going to be an ongoing endeavor. It's going to be an endeavor that will naturally need to focus not only on reducing the direct costs of wind and solar assets, but also increasingly on the pursuit of various approaches to enhance the grid system value of those assets. Or said maybe a somewhat different way, now is not really the time to be complacent, gloating about low power purchase agreement prices and the technological advancements that have enabled those price points. Those are significant achievements to be sure, but the energy industry and the R&D community would benefit as well from a continued and even enhanced focus on how wind and solar interact with other grid assets and on the grid system value side of the equation. To that end, a select and rather general list of some possible future research directions are listed here on my final slide, though I would like to leave a few minutes for Q&A. And so in the interest of time, I think I'll end my presentation here to allow for a couple of questions, but I'll just leave this particular slide up on the screen. I don't think there's anything here that's terribly controversial, but perhaps useful for folks to observe some of my thoughts on where some future research directions might profitably be pursued. And with that, let's open it up for some Q&A, Charlie.
Brian, that was quite a tour through the area pricing and markets. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. Won't be able to get through all of them, but there's a couple on the topic of resource adequacy that we can kind of combine together, I think, into a little bit of a discussion question. And beginning with how you define resource adequacy. Did you use an economic measure, for example, in ERCOT, which would imply a reserve margin, I don't know, something less than the traditional 15% for sure? Or did you use the more arbitrary NERC, one day in 10 years kind of a measure? And subsequent questions or comments on that, along that line, point out that if there is an excess of capacity, that can also drive down prices. And I think there's some just people wondering about whether that was modeled or what the impact might be.
Yeah, so let me kind of begin to address these questions, but note that these might be also profitably taken offline, at least to some degree, partly because there were many different elements of the analysis that I just presented. So let me start with the historical look. At the beginning of the presentation, I was highlighting the capacity value of wind and solar, for example, and one might be curious about how to know how we calculated those capacity values. And in particular, in that case, we used the specific capacity market rules and prices that derive from the markets in question. So in ERCOT, of course, there is no capacity market, so there's no capacity value for wind in that region. But in many of the other regions, there is, and that derives from the capacity price or cost that we can observe in those markets, multiplied by the capacity credit that is given to wind in those regions, sometimes based on ELCC calculations, sometimes based on how much wind delivers during certain peak hours of the year, either in the summer or in both summer and winter. So we're really, in that case, building our analysis based on the specific rules and price outcomes that exist or did exist in wholesale power markets. For the purpose of the forward-looking analysis, that's where things get pretty tricky. Ultimately, in that analysis, we do have capacity balance. That is, we don't have excess capacity to meet NERC reliability rules. The wholesale market prices are modeled such that those pricing outcomes are just sufficient to get the right amount of capacity to maintain reliability based on regional rules for reserve margins. And so in the forward-looking analysis, we don't have a capacity excess, let's say, because we've retired plants that are not found to be profitable. That being said, in the historical analysis, of course, we're all aware that there is an overage of capacity in some of these markets. And that's why, if you go back to in some of the initial slides in the presentation deck, you will see that the addition of conventional thermal generators tends to depress prices, and as well, the retirement of generators tends to increase prices. But overall, it's certainly true in the historical analysis that many of the regions do have an excess of capacity, and that does impact pricing outcomes as well. So that provides a little bit of a tour, focused both on the historical analysis and the forward-looking analysis.
Okay, there's a lot beneath the surface there for sure. A couple of questions, Ryan, a little more specific, maybe easier to answer, about the cost of variable renewable energy, I guess wind and solar, without subsidies. We showed that sub 30 and sub 20 number, I think, on an early slide for the solar and the wind PPAs.
Yeah, so if you look at the levelized cost of energy for wind, we're actually in the middle, not in the middle, at the end of producing our annual wind technologies market report. And I will provide a little sneak peek here that the levelized cost of energy, so this excludes the impact of the production tax credit, the average plant built in the U.S. in 2018 for wind, the LCOE is 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour, or $36 per megawatt hour. That contrasts to PPA prices that are at and sometimes below $20 per megawatt hour. So there's kind of a 1.5 to 2 cent adder going from the PPA prices to levelized cost of energy in the case of wind. The price adder for solar PPAs is somewhat more modest. The investment tax credit is less valuable to solar than the production tax credit is valuable for wind. I don't have the numbers right at my fingertips, but if solar PPAs are oftentimes averaging about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, I would anticipate that the LCOE of solar is pretty similar to wind at this stage, in that sort of 3.5 to 4 cent range for large utility scale plants.
Okay, and then of course we could get into the discussion of what happens when you add batteries to the solar plant and get a hybrid, but perhaps we'll save that for another time. Okay.
Yeah, but note there, Charlie, that in that particular case, most people are thinking about sort of storage plants that are sized at maybe 1/4 to 1/2 of the solar capacity with 4 hours of duration. And recent PPA prices illustrate that kind of configuration might add to PPA prices about 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour, $5 per megawatt hour. So there's certainly a price adder there, but our analysis for California at least suggests that the value boost is in excess of the price adder.
Yeah, those are absolutely amazing numbers. I've seen them too. Okay, we're about at the top of the hour, so I think we're going to need to wrap it up. And as I mentioned earlier, and as a couple of questions came in, an email will go out once the presentations and the audio file have been posted. And we'll also be posting responses to the unanswered questions, simple, short responses, once they're ready. So I want to let everybody know we appreciate your engagement. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on August 20th. The webinar will feature the topic of the High Resolution Rapid Refresh Numerical Weather Prediction Model, that's a mouthful, or the HRRR as it's called, presented by Stan Benjamin of NOAA. It's a very timely topic both domestically and internationally, given the rapidly increasing interest and penetration of hybrid solar and some wind power plants in the electricity market. So I hope those of you who are interested will be able to join us. More information on all the webinars and meetings can be found on our website at www.ecig.energy under events and in the newsletters and informational emails. So Ryan, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you next month with Stan on the HRRR or at the Fall Technical Workshop in Charlotte in October. And in the meantime, take care, everyone, and thanks again for your participation.